in a constitutional republic, what are we supposed to do? Especially since we're not a direct democracy, like, what really should a citizen do? What a great question to have to constantly be coming back to over and over again. What does it mean to be a citizen, and how much is enough?
And the most important question, how is Appalachia pronounced? Well, the one thing I know is that I know next to nothing, which is why I typically talk to the smart people and I let them...
Oh, come on, Daniel. You know a lot of things. You do.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to Our Great Experiment. I'm Daniel Agamo. Today, I am ecstatic to share a conversation with you that I had with Professor of History Thomas Weyant. Dr. Weyant is a professor at Black Hills State University, and he's a former mentor and teacher of mine. We discuss his research, which he has conducted on 1960s student activism on college campuses in Appalachia. And through that, we draw comparisons between what's going on now and what was going on then, with the hopes of trying to extrapolate some wisdom to understand the debates over free speech, protest, activism that are going on campuses now. I hope you find something useful in this conversation. Dr. Weyant is truly one of the most influential members of academia and the academic world that I've been fortunate to meet. Beyond his brilliant research, he's a great teacher. Every student that has ever had a class with him, including myself, can remark on that. He's a truly good human being who has a lot of good things to share, and I really hope that comes through in this conversation. My email is ourgreatexperiment2025@gmail.com. Please enjoy this conversation. Professor Thomas Weyant, thank you so much for joining me. It's a privilege.
It is my honor to be here with you.
Yeah, so it's so fitting that I am getting a chance to talk with you today. I was at the University of Missouri's campus today, watching people engage in political discourse, activism. And in preparation for talking with you, I got a chance to read your book, Peace in the Mountains, which I want to plug for our audience. Peace in the Mountains, Northern Appalachian Students Protest the Vietnam War. And the most important question, how is Appalachia pronounced?
Okay, so that's actually a really good question. So there's a northern pronunciation and a southern pronunciation. The northern pronunciation is usually more of Appalachia, and the southern pronunciation is Appalachia. But here's the thing: when the War on Poverty started, and a lot of folks kind of poured into the region, most of them said Appalachia, and so just kind of regionally, as a response to that, even in kind of the northern pronunciation amongst folks kind of gets, nope, it's Appalachia. It's the way of distinguishing who is part and who is not part. It's the same with Missouri, right? Because it's either Missouri or Missouri, right? And I mean, didn't Missouri actually pass a state law on the correct pronunciation because there was such a controversy? But yes, Appalachia. But whatever, call it what you want. So.
That's good to know. I always say Appalachia, but now that we have the heavy-handed question out of the way, I was really thinking about this concept that you write of in your book, the student citizen, and whether that concept is still alive today. And so I guess to begin, I'm curious if you could explain a little bit more about what you mean when you write about the student citizen model.
Yeah, so one of the things that in the way I kind of structure and think about things in the book is to think about this idea of citizenship as the unifying factor in the various forms of student engagement that you see in the 1960s. But there's also this dual identity, this notion of being a student and a citizen. And what does that mean? And a lot of that comes from the fact that in the 1960s, all the way up until we get to the passage of the 26th Amendment, which lowers the voting age down to 18, most college students don't have the right to vote. And their political participation is much more limited, at least in the sense that they cannot vote. There are other ways you can participate. But there's also this idea, this kind of comes out of the kind of Cold War conceptions of the university as the nation in microcosm. And so if you demonstrate good citizenship habits at the collegiate level, then you can demonstrate maybe this idea that maybe the voting age should be dropped. Practicing citizenship, but also not just practicing citizenship, but actually being citizens. The idea that while I might be limited in what I can do outside of the university, as a student of this university, I am fully 100% a member of this university. And that kind of active citizenship that is a hallmark of kind of Cold War era, right? That kind of idea that one should be engaged. I can do that here. And so you get this kind of dual sense of being a citizen of the university and citizen of the nation, and how those then interplay with each other. And that's, I really found that kind of very fascinating. And then how students built out those notions of citizenship.
And so you're writing at a time of mass mobilization, how we understand the 60s, whatever years that entails, but you focus specifically on 3 universities in Appalachia. And you talk about this popular image of it being kind of left out of the conversation, maybe being perceived as backward, right? And so I might have a little sense of what drew you to this area, but for those listening who aren't familiar with your research, what drew you to looking specifically at Northern Appalachia?
Okay, so a couple things there. So I grew up mostly in Western Pennsylvania. And what I find very fascinating is amongst my group of friends and people that I grew up with, though it's wholly within the region of Appalachia, wholly within how the Appalachian Regional Commission defines this space, we just called it Pennsyltucky. We didn't want to call it Appalachia because Appalachia was a Southern thing. It was a very negative thing. But it is. I mean, the region is within Appalachia, and it's one of those things where when scholars talk about Appalachia, for the most part, their focus is the central portion, like southern West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, right? Like that's the region that they're focusing in on. And I wanted to say, okay, I'm not discounting that, but Appalachia comes further north, and northern Appalachia is different from the rest of Appalachia. It has many of the same things. It's a little bit wealthier, saying that, and someone, from Altoona, PA going, no. It is, but it's not. Like there was a stronger railroad boom in the northern parts of Appalachia that allowed it to kind of pass along things a little bit faster or longer than southern Appalachia. But, I went to the University of Pittsburgh as an undergrad, so I wanted to think about the city of Pittsburgh. Because again, when we think Appalachia, we think rural, we think, out in the hollers. We don't think, a major metropolitan area. Now, again, we can debate whether or not Pittsburgh is a major metropolitan area, but from Pittsburgh in the north to Birmingham in the south, there are cities in Appalachia. So it has the same urban problems on some level as maybe presenting differently. But it has those same urban issues, those suburban issues. Like, what does the flight to suburbia in the Cold War look like in Appalachia? We don't talk about that because we're like, there's no cities in that one. Yes, there are. But that's like, I really just wanted to focus in there. Plus, originally the plan had been to look just in the city of Pittsburgh, to look at 4 colleges in the city of Pittsburgh and really kind of focus in there. And my advisor said, you might want to widen out. And so I did. And then he's like, you might want to step away from Pittsburgh. And I said, I can get a new advisor. And so he's like, okay, I guess we'll be fine with these 3. So.
And just to get a sense, I've driven through Kentucky and
Sure.
West Virginia, but just how different, right? If we think about all these different regions in Appalachia, how different are the cultures?
Well, that's a really good question. I would actually suggest that there is a lot of similarity. There's a lot that connects. I remember going to an event in kind of southwestern North Carolina and going, oh, this feels like home. But to be fair, um, one of the places, weirdly enough, that I felt like, oh, this is home, is Lee Deadwood in South Dakota. Um, Mountain folk are mountain folk. There's a certain amount of spaces that have these kind of extractive industries that kind of dominate, and then kind of so there are these places throughout America where you can kind of find intense similarities. Um, there are definite differences. The Black Hills are a little bit further apart than the Appalachians, right? The range is a little bit tighter, but yeah, mountain folk are mountain folk to a certain extent. But
That's really interesting. I think we could have an entire conversation just on its own about this concept of industry exodus and the effect. But
yes, very
so
much.
you write about this movement of
Mhm.
activism from an activism that is more locally based, community based,
Mhm.
to an activism that is more nationally focused. What drove that change in focus?
It's a fantastic question. And the way I frame it in the book is kind of a difference between Freedom Summer, right, and participating in the Mississippi Freedom Project, and then kind of the marches on Selma within the civil rights movement, kind of seeing a distinction there in that local activism, really required kind of long periods of time, building a community or helping a community to build the tools necessary for change versus demonstrations and showing up and having these large marches. And what we can see, looking at, say, the anti-war movement, right, or free framing it, the peace movement, however you want to, the thing that became the driving factor was crowd size, right? And on some level, that's because the media is really good at following a horse race, and really good at kind of identifying, oh, there was 10,000 people who showed up at this. All right, well, the next one should have 12,000, right? As organizers, just like, how do we escalate? How do we, build that out? And it's a lot easier to show up to a demonstration, march, maybe do something for a day or two, and then go home, right? As opposed to, I'm going to take the next 6 months and I'm going to engage this way. That's not to say the local activism didn't went away. It just wasn't where people focused their attention. And what really gets interesting is then you kind of see this kind of build up, build up, build up of, okay, now we're talking about rallies and events that are 150,000, 200,000, 300,000. And then that kind of ends real quick. Kind of drops off. And that local activism is still there, just kind of chugging along. And the question is, do you actually need to have events where there are 100,000, 200,000 people showing up so that that local small activism can say, like, look, we're representative of a much larger feeling out there? I would say you kind of need them both to kind of affect some level of change. But yeah, it became this kind of, and some of this also, like, the people who are involved in the civil rights movement are involved in anti-poverty work, are involved in anti-war work, they're involved in they're in so many things that they had to kind of like, oh, I can go to this rally, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, because they're trying to do everything. Weirdly enough, we all kind of have that age where we think that we can do everything all at once, at all times. Some of us don't outgrow that, but I think that's part of it. So,
When I think about activism today, and
mm,
maybe the stuff you see on social media, it's largely focused on national issues
mhm,
or even international issues, but there's still a large presence. And I'm curious if you also observe this,
sure.
especially as it relates to maybe the protesting or objection to state legislative law, or something the
Sure.
governor is about to sign. Do you still see local and maybe statewide activism as
Yeah.
having potential in this day and age?
Yeah, I think one of the other things is to think about, especially when we think about in that '60s moment. One of the things that the New Left really kind of focused in on was this idea of participatory democracy. To be fair, that kind of active citizenship idea is out there, that kind of all people are latching onto, but really the New Left focuses in on that. And this idea that the system doesn't work to a certain extent, so find ways outside of the system to generate change. And that's why some of these local things continue to work, because you got people who are like willing to build a co-op or build some sort of local thing to make it work. But in the process of doing that, they've also then stepped away from electoral politics to a certain degree, and then essentially opening up a space. If you step away, someone else is going to fill that void. And so now they're looking at, and then they start looking at, the electoral politics and saying, well, that's definitely not what I want. So like it just kind of reinforces this withdrawal. And what I think social media has done, for good in some cases, is help people who feel isolated find connections. People in a local community who kind of look around and say, I don't agree with the majority here, but I feel like I'm the only person. And so sometimes social media allows you to, oh, okay, actually, you also, okay, all right. There's another voice there. There's another person there. Okay. And so for good, I think on local issues, social media can be very good. I think it becomes dangerous when it becomes this kind of echo chamber of, I'm not going to listen to other views. And I think that's one of the things I found really fascinating in the way I was looking and researching for the book, is how actively engaged with the other view. I saw students very often finding, not in all cases, but finding those spaces where they're like, here's where we can agree. Here's where we disagree, and really engaging with those like I said, I think we see that today. I think we see some people finding those spaces and others not. But I think the focus on the national becomes easiest for the very simple fact that it's the biggest. Local issues, a lot of times people don't even realize what's going on. They don't know. And that's largely a function of our local media are being swallowed up by larger and larger regional, national, corporations. And so the local news doesn't always cover the local news per se. And so some people are just not getting information about what's happening locally. How can you have a discourse about what's happening if you don't know what's happening? I'm not saying we need to go back to having like 3 TV channels and, get rid of the internet, but there is something to be said about kind of individuals having to talk to each other. To actually have to engage, and hearing. Well, I think the other thing is all of like these big media corporations have these. So you look at Fox News, MSNBC, CNN. You got a lot of commentators, right, out there, kind of telling us all these wonderful things. You didn't have that in the '60s. So where did you go to find commentary on some of these things? Well, you would look to local experts. Well, I don't need to look to a local expert because, Glenn Beck, Bill O'Reilly, Rachel Maddow, whomever, they're already out there giving me that. I don't need to listen to the local folks because I already got the net. So, like, again, don't frame me as I want to get rid of big media like that, whatever. But it's just changed where our influence leaders are.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up social media, because I think as social media further develops,
Mm-hmm.
some people perceive there to be a really important difference between whatever real activism or real protest is in person, going out on the streets, tabling, whatever it is, versus posting on social media.
Right.
Do you perceive there to be a legitimate difference between the effectiveness of those two things?
So let me draw a parallel with the 1960s, right? One of the things that I, again, doing the research found really fascinating is you'd have a lot of like petition drives, right? Sign your name to this petition. We're going to send it to President Johnson or send it to, President Nixon, supporting the war or opposing the war, supporting this, opposing that, whatever it might be. So is signing your name to a petition that you walked across campus and just signed your name on any different than signing some of those online petitions, right? I mean, like it's the same. But weirdly enough, okay, so we don't have social media to kind of post your, to retweet something or whatever. But in the 60s, they wore a lot of buttons. And so people would literally walk around with those, like, well, essentially are memes just on their body, right? So you could see someone. It's like seeing their page today. Okay, I get you, all your memes. I'm with you now. You could get that from just someone, the pins that they would wear. And I don't know where we fell off the pin wagon, but I think it's a really, but again, in a time when there's no other place where you can post or repost or connect socially, in that pins provide so anyone who wants to bring back pin culture, in this way, I'm 100% for it, because I think it's pretty cool.
Bring back the political button.
Well, I mean, just so they had, like, just think of the 1964 presidential election, just that alone, right? You have the Goldwater pins that say, in your heart, he's right. And then the Democratic pin that said, in your guts, he's nuts. I mean, just that kind of ability to have that type of, you could walk down the street and see someone wearing the Johnson pin, or seeing someone wearing the Goldwater pin, and kind of just, all right, okay. Like, you're maybe not going to hang out with them, but like at the very least, I mean, like, there's that, without it saying a word. In the same way, but the thing is with social media, like, I never have to see the other, political view, because it's just going to, the algorithm's just going to give me that, and that's problematic in and of itself too. So,
And you draw a lot in your book about on student newspapers.
oh
And
yeah,
to me, growing up in my age, whether it was high school papers,
mhm.
a university paper, they're certainly not as prominent as they once were. And I'm curious what exactly we talk about the abundance of political commentators, in 2025. What impact did like student newspapers have on the student body at the time?
Oh, fantastic question. One of the things that's really kind of, that was lucky but not a surprise in terms of the research, is that I was able to, the three schools that I looked at had daily student newspapers. Um, In fact, Ohio University, their student newspaper won awards regularly. And in fact, many of the folks who wrote for that student newspaper, went through the journalism program at Ohio University, have gone on to be successful national news writers. I mean, it's a really great program. That's not to take anything away from Pitt or West Virginia, but, they took those things very seriously. Because again, there is no other place, right? There's no social media for them. There's no Insta, there's no Snapchat, there's no, and like, this is where you're going to engage. But this is also an era that said, one of the things you do is you get up in the morning, you read the newspaper. This is just how, so into the 1960s, the average amount of time on television for national news was a 15-minute evening news broadcast and a 15-minute local news broadcast. And some local news broadcasts were literally just people sitting there reading the newspaper. So we're talking about a moment when the newspaper is one of the most vital forms of sharing information. And it becomes kind of the space in which students can express themselves. Now, again, the letters to the editor are always kind of curated, right? They have to filter through the editor as to who they're going to, publish. Um, and what stories get published sometimes can be determined by different levels of administration. But in some ways, it's one of the only tools we have to get at the voice of a student in that moment, right? And to see some of the discussions back and forth that are happening. And seeing then, weirdly enough, also it was really cool to see like a name pop up in a letter to the editor in October, and then to see that name pop up in an event in February, and then to see that name pop up again, a year later, some other thing, like, and so you could trace, students and their activism through that newspaper that I don't know any other source that would have given me that. But like I said, I think we don't have, I am, I would say I pity historians who are going to focus on this moment in time, and they're going to have to try to sift through Instagram and Facebook and X and all and try to find all of that and try to. Oh my goodness, that just sounds like a headache. Um, but I mean, there's a lot out there that's worth that. And like I said, without having other outlets, that newspaper is so important. And the fact that it was a daily thing and they took it seriously. It wasn't like, I'm on the student newspaper. It was like, it was a big deal to be on the student, to be the editor of the student newspaper, especially at Ohio University. That was a big deal. People really were serious about these things, even if they didn't go on into journalism. I think that's the other thing. Like one of the editors for the Pitt News, if I remember correctly, went on to be an engineer. Doesn't really surprise me. Pitt has a very good engineering program, but like, oh, you didn't even go into journalism. No, that wasn't what I cared about, but I took it seriously when I was there. I think that's fascinating.
And the time you're writing at, what an interesting time to be a university student. You
Oh yeah.
talk about all these different tragedies,
Mm-hmm.
big national events that are going on at the time. Of course, throughout the 60s, you have President Kennedy assassinated in
Mm-hmm.
63, RFK, MLK, but
Okay.
then specifically the Kent State tragedy.
Oh sure.
How does this impact the trajectory of mass mobilization?
Yeah, Kent is an interesting thing. I studied at Kent State for a little while, and I remember just kind of being on campus. Even today, and this is partly because of folks from that moment in time actively saying we're going to preserve the memory of this. So that's interesting. But I think Kent becomes this kind of really important tipping point, not in and of itself, right? There's a lot going on in that moment, right? It's the end of the academic year, right? In fact, finals were supposed to be going on. I know at least one person who was to defend their master's thesis, who ended up defending their master's thesis in their professor's front room because the campus shut down. Um, but at the beginning of the semester, the beginning of the year, you have the moratorium in October of 1969, the largest decentralized anti-war movement to date. This happens at thousands of campuses around the country, millions of people participating, and it does show that shift again from like everyone let's meet in DC and whatever to do activism where you are, returning to that local space. So you start the year um, coming home from Woodstock, maybe, and then you got the moratorium, and then you've got events there in the end of 1969. You come back to campus, the beginning of you've got President Nixon saying, "I'm going to kind of move us out of Vietnam," but then at the end of April of 1970, saying, "Oh, actually." We're going to invade Cambodia as well. And people going, well, that's the opposite of what I want in this big explosion, um, somewhat literally, mostly figuratively, explosion of protest. But I think it's that moment when the realization that there are people who are dying on this. It's really a fascinating why this is questions that Kent State folks talk about all the time. People will really focus on why does the National Guard have live ammunition? Um, that's a great question. The National Guard, which isn't trained necessarily in dispersal tactics, all of these things, there's so much kind of all colliding into each other. And the perfect storm of the students being pushed up over the ridge to a space where they can't actually get out of, and all of that kind of coming together. But so many people kind of come out of Kent State going, can anything actually change? Like this entire academic year, from beginning to end, we have all of these events happening, and the only thing that seems to be happening is students are getting shot. Again, that's a certain perspective, right? And I think some people just said, I'm tired. I'm done. I'm burnt out. There's nothing more I can do. But then you look in 1971, you get the 26th Amendment, people are still doing things. It's this transition back to a local focus. So that kind of ramp up to the big things, and now it's back local. And I think just Kent State said, I think a lot of people came out of that saying, this is there's too much, and I don't know what to do at this point. And I would also argue, at least when we're talking on college campuses, if you're there as a freshman in 1970, and graduated in 1974, you're living a very different time than if you showed up in 64, 65, 66, right? 64, 65, 66, those freshmen, for the most part, had some potential draft deference, right? By 69, 70, 71, 72, the draft lottery is in place. And so that's a very different reality. And the draft is one of those things, at least for anti-war activism, that becomes so important. But if we look at all the different strains of activism, it's not just anti-war, right? You mentioned the assassination of King, right? There is divisions happening in New Left organizations, divisions happening in civil rights organizations, different trajectories of other social justice movements. There's just a lot of fracturing in that moment, focused on different outcomes. And I mean, that's a very long answer to say, I wish I had a better answer. But there's something about that moment that just fractures for so many people. And then there's the hope of okay, 1972, we'll have a presidential election. A lot of young people just didn't show up for that either. So, but not showing up is a political act, right? I mean, I think that's something we should always keep in the back of our mindset. The withholding of my vote is a political act. Uh, we can debate whether or not it's a good political act, right? If enough people say, well, I'm just not going to vote, then politicians have no reason to speak to your issues, right? But it can be a very effective political tool to say, I'm going to withdraw this vote. But yeah, like I said, I think we're just seeing a shift by the early 70s, culturally on a lot of different spaces too. So yeah, I wish I had the answer. I've read too many books on Kent State to have the answer, though, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and this might be getting into the weeds a bit, but
Sure.
I'm particularly interested when we think of protests that happen on the same day, the same topic in 2025. We see it's very easy to spread the message, whether it's, via TikTok, Instagram, whatever. You talked about the moratorium. I'm just curious, how exactly was that message spread?
What a great question. Through student newspapers, but literally organizers kind of just spreading out to different campuses and just kind of spreading this idea and just sharing this idea. A lot of campuses are way more interconnected than we like to think. There was in Pittsburgh, in the late 60s, what was called the Pittsburgh Draft Information Center. And it was basically just kind of It was an organization that worked to help students or young people with draft reclassification and protesting and resisting the draft and things like that. But folks from Pittsburgh would actually travel down to Morgantown or out to Athens, Ohio, and vice versa. I mean, these people kind of moved around, and so they shared ideas, but they also wrote letters. I mean, there was a lot of, I mean, to go all the way back to the American Revolution, right? Like letters, the committees of correspondence, right? And sending out letters to each other. That still happened, right? Without social media just kind of amplifies things or quickens things that were happening before. So where you can send out a tweet now, boom, right? Previously it was, okay, let's put, type out a letter and send, copies of this letter to as many different, connections that I have. And so they can send out and things like that. Phone trees and all that type of stuff to help spread that information. But the moratorium was this, there was actually a group of people that kind of said, like, this is what we should do is have one day in the middle of the month where we just don't engage in business as usual. And there was already movements like this, right, at a very small scale. There were a bunch of Quaker vigils, right, that would happen Wednesdays at noontime, the middle of the week, the middle of the day, the middle of everything. Take an hour to silently sit and reflect on the world. This is the thing that's happening throughout the 60s. So some folks kind of said, well, why don't we do that on a bigger scale? Instead of everyone coming to Washington or San Francisco or New York or whatever, just stay where you are. Organize where you are. Just take one day and talk about the war. Not necessarily anti-war. It is predominantly anti-war, but the idea was, let's have a conversation. And we're going to do this and hope that that helps push our leaders towards change. And if it doesn't, next month we'll do it 2 times. And if that doesn't change it, then in December we'll do it 3 times. And if that doesn't, in January we'll do it 4 times. And we'll just keep doing it, escalating it more. And that didn't actually work that way. But that was kind of the threat of it. And what was so amazing, at least from my perspective, is that college administrators sometimes would listen to students say, you can shut down campus for the day to allow for this. And a lot of them said no. And weirdly enough, that no was a better answer than the yes, right? Because if they had said yes and campus is shut down, you're not really sacrificing much. If it's no, if business as usual is happening, then you're sacrificing. You're not going to class. That doesn't sound like as big of a sacrifice as maybe, like whatever, but there's a moment in time when faculty, like if you didn't show up for a class, basically could fail you. I mean, like not showing up wasn't a thing. You showed up. And faculty could, there was some serious penalties for missing class. So if the administration says we're going to shut down for the day, you face no penalties for showing up. Whereas if it's open, if classes are still being held, you have to make that choice. Am I willing to suffer what is comparatively a minor penalty, right? Comparatively, but still something that can have ramifications. Am I actually sacrificing something? And I found that really fascinating. Like the people who still did, because they said that's the sacrifice they're doing. And then the people who said, well, I can't miss class. What does that mean? And how do you negotiate that space? And I think there's a lot of people, and I'll throw myself in on this. There's a lot of us who look at situations and we're like, I want to, but I'm worried or afraid of the consequences. And I think that's what's so fascinating. So many people said, no, the consequences of not showing up, of not doing this are too big. And weirdly enough, the moratorium, again, largely coming from the political left, a lot of groups on the political right participated in some ways. Most of those folks still went to class, but they still did things in some cases. So it's a really fascinating moment. Yeah. And we don't talk about it. The moratorium is usually not an event that we talk about. Um, and especially at schools like West Virginia and Ohio and Pitt. But weirdly enough, two of the three ended up actually on the national news because of that, Ohio and West Virginia, because they are seen as these conservative campuses, yet they do these things. I think it's fascinating. They actually did moratorium at Black Hills State. It was Black Hills State Teachers College, I think so at the time. Um, 20 students wore black armbands. That was it. In response, in anticipation of that response, of what moratorium would be, the largest student organization at Black Hills at the time was the Veterans Club. They rented a plane and they flew over the city of Spearfish and dumped like 5,000 leaflets saying "America, love it or leave it." That was their way of anticipating the moratorium and responding. And I think 20 students with armbands and 5,000 leaflets. I think that's just fantastic.
And thinking about the role the administration plays
Yeah.
in these fights, political battles on campus, they still exist.
Yeah.
And thinking about, the way that administrators kind of get tied up in these battles, right? Trying to appease state legislatures, the Board of Regents, what have you. How do you think the history of this time should inform how we understand today's debates about the role of administration, the role of state oversight in higher education?
Oh yeah. One of the things is, okay, looking at this 1960s moment, Clark Kerr, who was the chancellor of the University of California system, he did a couple lectures and turned into a book called The Uses of the University, which he talks about this concept called the multiversity. And he argued that American college campuses by the early 60s weren't a singular university body anymore, but what he called the multiversity, this space where the distance between students and faculty and students and administrators was ever widening, and that gap, that increasing gap between the students and the faculty administrators created a greater sense of antagonism because you didn't know each other as well, right? So it was easier to kind of like paint each other in these very negative ways. But also there is at the same time a rise in a very different form of student. Um, I think it's Helen Lefkowitz Horowitz, I think it was, wrote a book when she kind of identified three different classifications of students, and I forget her classifications, but this idea that there are some students who show up to college to do all the college things, right? Join fraternities, join student government, go to homecoming, do all. Oh yeah, I should go to class. They're less. They don't care about necessarily grades and that type of thing. They're about the college experience, and that does include to some extent going to class and those things. There's another group of students that she identified as kind of unique or growing in the 60s that I would argue you see at different points, but in that moment, students who are also not interested in grades per se, but who are interested in challenging the college experience. They don't necessarily want to join student government or fraternities but they want to turn the university into a space of intellectual curiosity that they say it should be, and less focused on kind of preparation for some sort of future career, things like that. And then there's the group that is growing in the 60s and has dominated college campus ever since, the more professionally minded students who don't want to join organizations. They don't want to go to homecoming. They don't care about those aspects. What they want is to show up, go to class, do well, get their degree, and move on. Right? That is the dominant model of students post 1975, right, to today. And so we have then kind of these two other groups that are kind of hanging out. The radical group kind of ebbs and flows, but that traditional group is almost always there, right? And so how do you get people involved? when they just don't want to. And for some, it's not even that they don't want to; they can't. Um, they work, full time. They have kids. They have their own responsibilities away from campus. Um, it is today so difficult for so many people to get the education that they want, that they think is that they need. In many cases, that it will put them on the path to uh, better futures for any number of reasons. And so, when you need to work a full-time job in order to pay the tuition necessary to take these classes, you're less inclined to get involved in campus activities, whether it's you know uh, participating in the homecoming parade, or if it's being part of a student group that the young Republicans or the college Democrat. You're not going to get involved. You don't have the time. You don't have the ability. And somewhere someone has told so many of us something along the lines of, and it might be paraphrasing, but go to college, get your degree, get a job. And that's why so many people are here. That's it. It's not about the wider college experience. And some of that is because we have these multiversities now. Like, I don't know a whole lot of faculty in some of the other colleges because I don't see them. We're in different buildings, and this isn't a big campus, right? But we're in different buildings on other sides of the campus. We don't see each other. We don't engage that much. The students who might be, business majors may never really come down the hallway here to talk to a history faculty. Like, okay, I mean, we've siloed ourselves off. But we also, as I said earlier, we aren't reliant on the local folks to provide commentary on ideas, to provide the entertainment, right? Like, Athens, Ohio in 1965, 66, 67 is kind of a remote place. It's kind of a remote place today, but you have satellite TV. I mean, you're fine. But like, some of these places they're withdrawn, they're insular. That's what the college campus was like. That doesn't exist anymore. And I don't know if we should say we should go back to that, because I don't think that solves anything. What we have to do is figure out, how do we get people to want to be engaged? Um, and some of that is finding ways to help provide the opportunity, right, to make it a little bit easier for them to not have to do some of these other things, or that some of these other concerns are addressed so they can. But I don't know how to do that. Well, let me rephrase it. I have my own personal views on how to do that. But that doesn't mean that with the expertise that I have and the research I've done, that somehow entitles me to say, like, this is the answer. Um, but yeah, I think, like I said, I think in that moment in the '60s, there's there's not as much pulling away from campus because there's really nothing to do. That's not entirely true. It's not a great answer. I wish I had a better answer. I feel like that often. Do you feel like that often? There's a thing right in front of you, like, I feel like I should have a better grasp on that.
Well, the one thing I know is that I know next to nothing, which is why I typically talk to the smart people and I let them.
Oh,
Uh,
come on, Daniel. You know a lot of things. You do.
well, I am curious,
Yeah.
as a final question I have, when you think about, students today
Yeah.
and the different circumstances that they face, right?
Yeah.
They can 99.9% of college students today are eligible to vote, in
Yeah.
elections. Do you still see the student
Mm.
citizen ideal alive today?
Yes. Different, but yes. Um, in the sense, and again, I think it's worth noting that when we talk about the 1960s, we talk about kind of engagement in this moment, whether we're talking on the political left or the political right. It wasn't the majority, right? A lot of people didn't get, some got involved with things because that's what's happening today on campus. One of the things I found really fascinating when I was going through this was like Ohio University was a big participant in mock presidential elections in 1964 and 1968, and how many students got involved with that for any number of reasons. But we don't do that type of thing on campus anymore. And so some of it is students aren't participating because they don't have an opportunity, right? Like, what if we held these things? Would they show, and again, it's not always, like faculty or whoever who are holding it. It's students who are holding these events. If they don't feel that they should hold these events, they're not going to happen. But I still think that they have a sense of citizenship. But I think we are constantly changing how we view the role of a citizen, right? Just like we are constantly changing and debating how we see the role of the university in American life. What is the role of the university is a huge question. What is the role of a citizen is massive. How engaged should a citizen be? To what extent should they be contacting, representatives and elected officials? To what extent should they be engaged in some of these other spaces? Is it okay to just post memes and not do some of these other things? I don't know. I think one of the things to me that I think is really important in this moment that we're talking about in the 1960s is this idea that that citizenship required a certain amount of participation, right? That you had to engage. There was a sense of obligation, a sense of I don't know how to describe it, but this again across the political spectrum, this idea that you should be a part of this discourse and this dialogue. That I don't know if that is there today. I don't know if we encourage citizenship and we encourage those civic activities, but we also encourage to a certain extent, vote. Okay. But like what else? What does that mean? What are the duties and responsibilities of citizenship? And especially when we have sometimes a discussion back and forth about, okay, well, in a constitutional republic, what are we supposed to do? Especially since we're not a direct democracy, like, what really should a citizen do? What a great question to have to constantly be coming back to over and over again. What does it mean to be a citizen, and how much is enough? Right? How much is enough civic duty? I showed up and I voted, or I participated in this discussion, or I don't know. Like, I again, one of the things I love is being able to say in this space, there are a number of right answers. And what do we do when there are all of these potentially right answers? What is the appropriate level of engagement as a citizen? Well, we're all going to come up with a slightly different answer, and that's okay. I think that's what's really cool, right? Like there's a certain amount of acknowledging that, because I mean, like, students today are engaged. Students today are doing things like creating podcasts where they're talking to people about civic questions. They're putting that out there into spaces. Students are joining discussions about the unionization of, graduate, students. Students are raising questions about free speech. They're talking about things like what's going on in Israel and Palestine. They're talking about war. They're talking about famine. They're talking about what's happening domestically in terms of various policies and ideas. They're doing it. Is that enough for citizenship? Right? Does that have to be married to some sort of other action? And in the 60s, there was that idea universally held that action was necessary. That's also why you see then that rise in people showing up at protests and stuff. because that is an action I can do. Whereas I don't know if I have the capacity to do some of these other things. Less is asked of me if I show up to a big rally. Is that any less of engagement though? Right. And I don't know. I never want to fault someone for being able to participate to what their level of participation is. Some people don't like large crowds. Some people are afraid of talking in public. All right. Some people, so yeah, maybe just being online and having I'm going to say that I don't think any internet trolling is good. So like that maybe might be my line. If that's what you're doing, that's not okay. But that's kind of my personal line in the sand on that. But otherwise, if your level of comfort and ability, and even to a certain extent, even getting out of your comfort zone is to even just have a conversation online or even to post something on social media. For some people, that's getting out of their comfort zone. So again, I don't know if we can fault, because one of the things that would pop up time and time again with student activism that I looked at is you would see someone saying, hey, here at Ohio University, we're busy fighting about whether or not we can keep the library open until midnight, while other campuses, they're talking about human rights issues. It's like, yeah, well, that's because each campus is different. So judging yourself with someone else's yardstick, you're always going to come up short. Are you engaging here? Are you doing something? Yes. Does it have to look exactly the way I would do it? No. So I see that citizenship alive because I see students engaging, but in ways that maybe I wouldn't have, or I didn't. That doesn't make it any less. It just makes it different. And I think that's the key. I still think voting is an important component and people should do it. So register, go, and do. But yeah, I mean, decisions are made by those people who show up. And that doesn't mean necessarily to the town council meeting. It means even the people who show up online, right? That's still engagement. And we have to sometimes adjust how we think about it.
Yeah, there's no one correct form of engagement. And this conversation has been super informative to me. And I would really encourage anyone who finds this conversation informative, but especially current and former university students, to go read Professor Wyant's book,
Thank you.
because you will find striking similarities and similar topics that apply to current events and your experience as well. But Professor Wyant, this has been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much.
Of course. Of course, Daniel. Thank you for the opportunity. I am grateful to have had this chance to chat with you. I think what you are doing is fantastic. I love the fact that when you had a moment where you're like, things feel out of control, things feel like they are going in directions I don't like, that the way you're going to wrap your arms around this is to say, I'm going to provide a space in which we can have the type of discourse I wish I was seeing elsewhere. I love that. I love that you said, I'm going to throw my arms around this. I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to provide this type of forum as a way to address something that I see happening in my world. And I think that is exactly the type of engagement that maybe doesn't show up on the college campus. Unless you're walking around with a microphone asking people, and I don't think you've done that yet.
Not yet.
No, but I'm just saying, like, it doesn't show up beyond kind of the digital space to a certain extent, but it does open up the opportunity to have these types of conversations offline then as well. Once people can start to see that, oh yeah, I can have this type of discourse. So I love that when you were confronted with this, when something really hit you, you said, this is how I'm going to respond to it. I'm going to respond by trying to be positive and find spaces to do the thing I wish I saw happening. That to me is the exact drive of the student citizen of the 1960s. So yeah, thank you for this.
Thank you for the kind words, and I hope those listening find this conversation informative.
I hope so. I hope so.